welcome to part 2 of Living in Space. Last lesson we looked at radiation as the main focus. We talked about the effects of it, how we can reduce it in terms of, steel, water, soil, strong electromagnetic fields. We talked about the Van Allen belts and what they are. And we looked at some of the medical aspects in terms of microgravity and the effect on the bones. We're going to continue this lesson with some of the other aspects, and we're going to start off with isolation. Isolation is obviously a big issue. If you're spending a vast amount of time, say you're traveling to Mars, the average trip is between sort of 8 and 11 months. That's a lot of time to spend on a small craft with the same amount of people and the same people. Not to mention that in some cases there may only be 3 or 4 in a crew, and you both want to get on with them really well, but also just the fact that you're isolated for a long period of time. And things like the daylight is not going to be consistent. If you're pointing in the wrong direction, you might not see the sun for quite a while. You don't have a daytime and nighttime in space necessarily. And also just things like that. So keeping track of time, your body keeping track of your sleep cycle, all this kind of stuff. For this, we're going to look at a documentary done by Vsauce. So he did a series about the mind, and he talks about isolation as another one about aggression and things like that. But the isolation one is really applicable to us because all of the stuff that he talks about in here is relevant to spending long amounts of time in space and things like that. So the video goes for 34 minutes. Just sit back and enjoy it. There's some really good science in this. It ties in a lot of psychology, and this is the power of the space sector. Is just because we're studying physics doesn't mean that you have to go and be an engineer or a physicist. You can go in and become like an astromedical professional. You can be an astropsychologist, things like that. So you can specialize in the space industry with a whole range of different careers. You don't just have to be an engineer or an astronomer or something like that. And that's what I really love about this module. You can see the medical application, the psychological application, the biological application, all that kind of stuff. So this is a great application of all these different sciences and where they can come in.
Imagine being confined to a 10 by 10 foot room in complete isolation. No timekeeping devices, no phones, no books, nothing to write on, no windows. Psychologists say that fewer than 3 days in a room like this can lead to brain damage. I will be staying in this room for 3 days.
Clearly, he's on the border of misery.
Even in a city surrounded by people, it's possible to feel lonely or bored. Your brain is like a hungry sponge. It's constantly absorbing information. It thrives when stimulated. Between smartphones and books and movies and friends and family, thousands of sensations are constantly going into our heads. But what if it all got cut off? What is boredom? Well, it's believed to be an emotion that's a less intense form of disgust. A visual representation of emotions developed by Robert Plutchik shows them all on a wheel. Notice that boredom shares a spoke with disgust and loathing. They are different intensities of the same emotion. You see, boredom pushes us away from low stimulus situations because variety and stimulation literally lead to neurogenesis, brain cell growth. We are here today doing what we do because boredom has guided us toward greater and greater challenges and bigger and more complex brains. So, what is it like to be deprived of the sensations and social interactions so many of us take for granted? A landmark study at Harvard and Virginia universities found that students prefer to experience physical pain over 15 minutes of boredom. To demonstrate the surprising lengths people will go to avoid boredom, we brought in an unsuspecting subject for what he believes to be a focus group. We begin by introducing a set of stimuli, one of which is very unpleasant.
Oh, shit!
What?
Shocked the shit out of me. Touch it.
It did shock me.
No, it didn't. Did it really?
Yeah, it did. But
He doesn't like it.
Yeah, it really shocked me.
Our fake focus test continues.
So, let's start with the shock button. Jameson, would you choose to experience this again?
I don't want to do that again.
Why wouldn't you?
Because it shocked me and I can still feel it going down my forearm.
Now it's time for Jameson's true test, the test of boredom.
You will be in the room for 30 minutes. Please remain in your chair. Feel free to re-experience the electric shock button.
Okay.
Or not.
Okay.
All right, the moment of truth. When the only two options are boredom or painful shock, which will our subject choose? He's not even looking at the button. It hasn't even been a minute yet, and already Jameson is restless. With nearly a half hour to go and no other stimulation in the room, the shock button is a tempting object to occupy Jameson's mind. Remember what Jameson said a few minutes ago.
I don't want to do that again.
But will he desire stimulation so strongly he just goes ahead and pushes that button? It took exactly 1 minute and 57 seconds of boredom for Jameson's mind to go from never again to, sure, I'll give myself an electric shock to relieve boredom. Sometimes stimulation, any stimulation, is perceived as better than none at all. Now this guy doesn't like being bored, but can he resist touching it a second time? We're social animals. Whether it's another human or a volleyball or an electric shock button, you'll make friends with whatever you need to. Jameson, I'm Michael. Thanks for coming in today. So tell me a little bit about what you've been up to here in this room.
I've been just sitting in this room with a button.
Yeah?
And despite saying I didn't want to press it again, I pressed it twice.
Why?
I was just bored in this room, I suppose. So,
Really?
Yeah.
Did that hurt?
Yes.
The hypothesis is that when left alone with a very negative stimulus, people will go ahead and re-experience it just because it's something to do.
I'm one of them.
Some people choose isolation to learn about isolation. As we prepare to explore other planets, we're faced with a little issue. Stuff in outer space is really far apart. Within our own solar system, even a trip to Mars would take months in each direction. That's a long time to spend cut off from the rest of humanity, stuck in a tiny spaceship. To get ready for those journeys, we have subjected some people to extreme conditions here on Earth. In 1989, a young Italian interior designer named Stefania Fellini volunteered for a NASA experiment to help study the effects of isolation associated with space travel. She spent 130 days alone in a plexiglass cell in a cave 30 feet underground in New Mexico. In the absence of timepieces and any sign of day or night, Miss Fellini's body was thrown out of whack. Her menstrual cycle stopped, and her sleep-wake cycle changed radically. She tended to stay awake for 20 to 25 hours at a time, sleeping about 10 hours. When she finally emerged, she mistakenly believed she'd only been underground about half as long as she actually had. As difficult as Stefania's experience was, at least she had books to read. In my isolation chamber, I will only have white walls to stare at. Alone time. What a pleasure. Checking out, getting away from it all, relaxing. Banishment from society, the silent treatment, solitary confinement. Solitude isn't always nice. What happens when isolation is not voluntary? William Brown has first-hand knowledge of solitary confinement. So William, how much of your life have you spent in prison?
Probably like 16 years.
It's like almost half your life.
Yeah, basically almost half my life. Because I went to jail when I was 18, armed bank robbery. This right here, this was my home off and on about 2 years. The whole.
What was the longest stretch of consecutive time?
It was like 5 months total.
I'll tell you what really amazes me. This feels so much worse than a jail cell. This doesn't have bars letting in light or a view.
Not at all.
Would you have a mattress at least?
That would be the only thing in this particular cell. That would be the only thing in here. You would just have a mattress, and other than that, you would have nothing more. This light would constantly stay on, so there would be, you know.
That light's always on.
That light is always on.
Even at night.
Even at night, that light is always on. You're left in here with your thoughts, and that's it.
These are some examples of spacecraft and space suits. So obviously in space, when you're not in the ship, these need to remain pressurized. You need to have a simulated atmosphere in there for you to breathe, and you need to control the temperature within. Space itself is extremely cold. So these need to have some sort of a heating system in them, and they obviously need to be very airtight so that the vacuum of space doesn't suck all of your oxygen out. You can see here all of the different features they've got, from your parachute handle, GPS, the helmet, etc. You'll often see in the movies or in some of the photos, the helmets have a really goldy, reflective appearance. Often what they have is you have your standard airtight, whether it's a glass or a polycarbonate style material, and then they have a second layer, which is a visor. And the visor is actually a very thin sheet of gold foil. And the reason that they use gold foil is actually because of that radiation aspect. So rather than the radiation damaging your eyes and things like that, and it can be extremely bright, they use a very thin piece of gold foil, and this is quite effective at stopping the radiation from getting through. You can see down here we also have 4 layers to the suit. So there's a comfort liner on the inside so that it's doesn't feel like you're wearing a plastic bag, the gas membrane to seal the pressure, the restraining mesh to hold it all together, an outer fire retardant and thermal insulating layer to keep you warm and make sure that you don't melt or catch fire in your travels. We will talk about sound next semester in a lot more detail when we do light and waves, but sound requires a medium to travel through. So this means it needs something, some object, some gas, some particle in order for it to transmit. So in space, if you were out standing on the moon, or you were on Mars, or floating around in space, there is nothing around you for the air to vibrate or the gases to vibrate and transmit that message. So space is completely silent. Obviously you have radios and things like that that are going to work, but that's only within your suit. As soon as you go out and start wandering around in space, no matter how loud you yell, no one else is going to be able to hear you because that sound does not transmit. This is a great little example of some of the psychology of being in space. So a lot of the time we take noise for granted, and there's great research out there about things like white noise to help people sleep and relax and things, and the body doesn't generally cope very well with an absence of noise. And this is a clip from the movie Interstellar. This is a great little example of how it can be affected and some of the things that we might take for granted.
This gets to me, Cooper. This. Millimeters of aluminum, that's it, and then nothing. out there for millions of miles won't kill us in seconds.
You know that some of the finest solo yachtsmen in the world don't know how to swim. They don't know. If they go overboard, they're done. We're explorers, right? This is our boat. Here.
So I really like that clip because it's a great representation of this isolation and this silence effect of, in this case, he was getting a little bit stir crazy and he was becoming very insecure about the safety and how easy it is to die in space, how ruthless it is. And something as simple as just having that white noise of some rain and some crickets and some thunder is enough to kind of relax you and it almost gives you that earthy feel. It makes you feel connected, or you kind of trick your brain into thinking you're not out in the middle of nowhere where no one can possibly help you. Hallucinations are a pretty common thing in space, and this has happened throughout the range of trips and missions that have happened. And an example of that is that in 1976, a Russian crew from the Soyuz 21 mission were actually brought back to Earth early because they reported this smell on board, and they were worried that there might have been a fluid leak, and that's obviously not a good thing. So they brought them back and had a look, and they couldn't find anything. They did all these investigations and all this research, and they couldn't find anything to suggest that there was a leak. No one else could smell anything when they got on board, and they suspect that this might have been actually the crew hallucinating. And this is sort of a group effect hallucination. Thankfully, NASA are pretty good with this stuff. Obviously, they care about every aspect of space and the well-being of their astronauts. And there's actually a whole string of science called aerospace psychiatry and aerospace psychology. So your focus here is to provide mental health support to these aviation professionals. So whether they're astronauts or pilots and things like that, it's all about that. So, again, like I said before, physics is not necessarily just connected with engineering and becoming an astronomer and things like that. You can specialize and study physics and then later specialize in psychiatry or psychology and become something like an aerospace psychologist, which would be a really interesting. And with the way that things are going, with more people talking about moving to the moon and Mars and stuff like that, this aerospace psychology is going to become very prevalent. It may become a very booming industry. One of the things that you may not have thought about is that how you talk can actually say quite a lot about your mood. And the psychologists and these aerospace psychiatrists can use this information to analyze you from remote distances and try and judge how your well-being is going purely off the way that you talk.
Go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and the final liftoff of Discovery. A tribute to the dedication, hard work, and pride of America's space shuttle team. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Discovery now making one last reach for the stars.
Measuring bodily stress is done now in the space station. They take urine samples and blood samples and so on. But when you're talking about the psychological stresses of space travel, the situation is much more complex. One way that we think we can help is to look at their speech, or in particular to look at their speaking. In other words, the way in which they use speech, the way in which they sound, and the kinds of words that they use when they speak.
Now let's try backwards.
Speech is quite a good test of all kinds of aspects of well-being because it's affected both by the physiological state and the psychological state of the individual. So to explore whether we could use voice to detect changes in mood and psychological well-being, we looked at the recordings made during the Mars 500 simulated mission to Mars. 6 cosmonauts were sent on a 9-month trip inside a module, although the module didn't go anywhere, it was just parked in a car park. What we were able to show was that analysis of the audio recordings did indeed show situations where a particular speaker may have changed their mood or changed what their sort of level of excitement or what they were, or the topic of discussion became exciting, and that affected the way in which they spoke. And we were able to identify particular recordings which, in our sense, were anomalous, that they didn't seem to follow the standard pattern of the person's speech. And so we could say at this particular day, on this particular recording, the way in which this person was speaking was unusual. Whether the way in which they feel affects the way that they speak, and whether we can pick up those signals automatically, and then from that analysis of their voice, try and raise the alarm if characteristics of their voice are sort of outside their normal parameters. So anything we can do to try and monitor and detect these psychological stresses might be very valuable in protecting the health of the astronaut.
Another psychological effect in space is called the overview effect. And this is a result of seeing the reality of Earth in space. So when people fly out into space and they look back and they see the Earth, and they immediately sort of see it as this tiny little fragile ball of life, which is everything that they've ever known and everything that is humanity, just hanging in this sort of open void, floating around in space with this tiny little atmosphere. And this sort of destroys their notion of national boundaries, and it conflicts with the divide between people and races and stuff like that. And it kind of creates this sort of real deep emotional connection with people that this tiny little blue dot is us, and it needs to be protected. So a couple of quotes from some astronauts. So Michael Collins from the Apollo 11 mission said that the thing that really surprised him was that it projected an air of fragility. I don't know why. I don't know to this day. I had a feeling that it's tiny, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it's home, and it's fragile. And also Catherine Sullivan talked about it as well, and it's a similar sort of concept. So talking about this real emotional connection to looking back at Earth and feeling this overwhelming sense of we need to protect this, and it sort of makes everything else feel insignificant. Like it's hard to be discriminant between people and sort of have that grudge against someone when you look back and you see how tiny and how fragile the Earth is in the grand scheme of things. And this is the overview effect. So from here, we're going to look at the Living in Space Engineering Challenge. I'm going to explain this in a different video. So have a look at that video once you've completed this and get stuck into the engineering challenge.